Thank you all for joining us today. We will get started shortly. Thank you for your patience while we're still getting up and running. Your emergency exits are to your right back here and to the left back over there. Thank you and have a great day.
Yes.
So nice to see you all here. My name is David Ring. I'm the director of the graduate program in medical and biological illustration. On behalf of all of the faculty and the staff and the students, I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon and welcome you, whether you're here in person or you're joining us remotely. What you're about to see is the culmination of about 10 months of intense work on the part of the wonderful class of 2024. The master's thesis requires students to immerse themselves in a scientific content area and in an illustration and communication techniques that, in many cases, are relatively new to the students. In developing their projects, students take on the role, and this is a bit of a list, it could be longer, of co-creator, researcher, writer, producer, storyboard artist, animator, sculptor, illustrator, and programmer, among many others. And today, they're going to take on the role of presenters as well. Through their exploration of the subject matter and their search for an effective solution to a unique communication challenge, the students have drawn on their talents and their training to create projects that, as you will see in a moment, are visually captivating, artistically compelling, and done with amazing craftspersonship. We ask that you especially appreciate the novel contribution that each student has made in their own way to the advancement of the scientific topic and to the art of biomedical communication. These projects and all of the incredible work of the class of 2024 demonstrate the very core of what we do as medical illustrators. That is to first thoroughly understand the topic, identify the communication challenge, know the audience, and develop effective visual solutions to teach important information in science and human health. I know we're all excited to see the presentation, so with that, I would like to invite my colleague, Corey Sandone, to the podium to introduce our first student. Corey is the director of the Department of Art as Applied to Medicine and the lead faculty for the thesis course. Corey.
Thank you, David. I just want to extend my welcome to everyone here today and send a special appreciation to the faculty members in our department, to the preceptors who are in other departments. It's wonderful to see you here today. We appreciate all your sharing of knowledge and time, expertise, and support of our students in the amazing class of 2024. I also want to say a hello to everyone who is visiting remotely. I know we have alumni and other family and friends of the students who aren't able to be with us today. We'll get started with our first presenter. Ann Seliger is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin at Madison. She earned her BS in biochemistry as well as a certificate in art studio.
Right. Hi, I'm Ann Seliger. I'll be presenting Why Shed the Shield, a narrative-based educational campaign for discontinuing gonadal shielding in pediatric radiology. I worked with Dr. Mahesh from the Department of Radiology and my faculty advisor, Lydia Gregg. Gonadal shielding is placing a protective barrier between patients and the source of radiation to reduce exposure to the gonads. It's been standard practice in diagnostic imaging for decades, but it's been re-examined in the All right, I'll just pick up where I left off then. All right, gonadal shielding is placing a protective barrier between patients and the source of radiation to reduce exposure to the gonads. It's been standard practice in diagnostic imaging for decades, but it's been re-examined in the past few years. In 2019, the American Association of Physicists in Medicine released a statement recommending that shielding be discontinued, citing current radiation exposure research and concerns about exam efficacy. Since then, some hospitals have adopted no-shield policies, including the Johns Hopkins Hospital in 2023. But shielding is a legacy practice, and these policy changes are all very recent. There are three broad reasons for this. First, shielding offers negligible benefits to patients. The current radiation doses used for imaging pose no measurable harm to the gonads. Second, shielding can obscure anatomy. Especially in pediatrics, shields are frequently misplaced and compromise diagnostic information, requiring repeat exams. Finally, shields can interfere with automatic exposure control, which modern X-ray machines use to control radiation output. A shield in the imaging field of view may cause the machine to increase its output, resulting in a higher radiation dose. Radiology technologists are responsible for performing exams and enacting no-shield policies. However, discontinuing shielding is a departure from how technologists were trained in the past. There is a need for educational materials to help transition diagnostic imaging practice away from shielding. To address this, we created a narrative animation for technologists. Our approach uses narrative communication, where the characters, emotions, and imagery of a story convey a message to audiences. Studies of other campaigns have found that the communication of educational content as a narrative can be more effective at promoting desired health outcomes. By incorporating narrative into our project, we hope to create material that is relatable and engaging to technologists. The objective of this thesis was to create a narrative animation for professional and student technologists about the science behind no-shield policy and how to discuss it with patients and caregivers. We received IRB approval to perform a knowledge assessment and engagement survey with technologists to evaluate the efficacy of the animation. I defined the content of the animation through informal interviews with medical physicists and technologists. I also reviewed text guides and presentations technologists at Johns Hopkins had received for the project. For developing the animation, the script and storyboard were created in Procreate and PowerPoint. My preceptor and technologist advisors provided feedback on the content, language, and character depictions. From those boards, assets were drawn in Illustrator and Photoshop, then animated in After Effects. For our study, technologists completed a pre-test, then watched the animation. Then they did a post-test and an engagement survey. The pre and post-test were composed of the same 6 multiple choice questions about current science and policy around shielding. We used test scores to assess if knowledge was gained after watching the animation. For the engagement survey, participants ranked statements about their enjoyment and understanding of the animation. We used those responses to assess engagement. Our survey was performed through Qualtrics and 6 in-person sessions with professional technologists at Hopkins. And now I'll show a segment taken from the final animation.
I noticed you didn't use a Gonad shield for that child's X-ray.
Yeah, I recently learned that you're not supposed to use shield on anyone. The American Association of Physicists in Medicine put out a position statement about it.
What? But we've been shielding for years. It was all over our X-ray registry exam.
Shielding has a long history, but it's time to change. Dosage shielding became a part of clinical practice in the 1950s, when it was thought radiation exposure during exams would harm reproductive cells. Current research finds the gonads aren't more radiosensitive than other organs, like the breast or colon. The rationale for gonad shielding is to prevent damage to a patient's future offspring. But to this day, there have been no observed hereditary effects from radiation at the doses used for imaging. But imaging technology has advanced a lot. Over the last 70 years, radiation doses from X-ray scans have reduced over 20 times. The dose needed to cause infertility is more than 1,000 times what's used in an X-ray scan.
All right, so that was the animation that we created. And now I can talk about some of the results from our evaluation. From our population of 41 technologists, overall scores improved after watching the animation. Our analysis found this score increase to be significant. We also received open response feedback stating that some questions were wordy or confusing, which is a consideration for future iterations of the study. For the engagement survey, participants rated agreement with statements on a 7-point Likert scale, where 1 is strongly disagree and 7 is strongly agree. The animation received positive feedback, with scores for each statement falling within the 5.9 to 6.6 range. Length and understanding had particularly high scores, and written feedback stated participants found the video informative and would recommend it as a resource for other staff. So to recap, we created a 5-minute narrative animation for technologists about discontinuing shielding. The animation was evaluated positively for both learning and engagement. Scores increased significantly, and technologists rated the video high for enjoyment, understanding, and relatability. This feedback reflects literature about the persuasive, engaging power of narratives. By publishing our study, we aim to contribute to a growing body of knowledge about narratives in education. And now we're working on sharing our work. We plan to distribute the animation nationally through radiology professional organizations. We're also submitting a manuscript to the Journal of the American College of Radiology. For the study itself, we plan to revise questions for clarity ahead of any further testing. And that concludes my thesis work. I'd like to thank my preceptor, Dr. Mahesh, my advisor, Lydia Gregg, Tina Miller, Paula Frank, and the radiology technologist staff for their guidance. Thank you also to the Vesalius Trust for funding this work. And now I welcome any questions or comments. Yes, Ben.
How frequently are narrative animations used, at least in school Johns Hopkins, and with this animation study, do you see that expanding further when retraining or otherwise educating?
Yeah, so to our knowledge, from our literature review, we didn't find other studies of narrative animations for radiology education. A lot of times you do see them incorporated in patient education, for example. Like you tell the story of a person who's going through something, right? And I can definitely seeing something like this incorporated in other educational campaigns, just because it's a very digestible way to convey this information and it's easily shared online, right? So I think it complements, you know, your more traditional like lecture-based training really well. Dr. King?
That was really fantastic. Well, one of the things that really struck me was within the animation, your use of transitions from sort of one image to another, where you know, something in one image sort of turned into something that's in particular with some of your perhaps figures. It was a really nice way to make those transitions. And I wonder, did you go through several iterations of how to do that? How did you arrive on that number of approach?
Yeah, so a lot of the visual development was kind of a back and forth with both my preceptor and my faculty advisor. Before we actually went into After Effects to do these animations, we planned everything out with really rough sketches in the storyboard phase. And from there, we were able to decide, okay, let's go from this content to this content, or transition with this visual elements.
Really effective.
Thank you, thank you.
I have a question because you just mentioned that you did storyboarding and you mentioned before that you're publishing a version in the journal. Would you consider doing like a graphic novel version that uses some of those images as a way to educate? Like, would you consider that a better tool than just like text-based?
Yeah, you know, funny story about that. That was one of the original media formats that we discussed with my preceptor. Ultimately, we decided on like a 5-minute video, right? Because our target audience is professional student technologists who might be really busy and only have time to watch something like on the go. But, you know, I love comics. I'm a big comics fan. I think it's really cool to explore different ways to convey educational content that are engaging to a bunch of different people.
Thank you. I just asked because I went to a librarian seminar recently about a library in Delaware that is funded by the DHSS that is all like, it has a whole section focused on graphic novel and like, using it as a way to educate medical professionals. So yeah, I'm very interested.
Yeah, thank you. All right, thank you. The next presenter is Grace. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh yeah.
Presentation. Are the plans to distribute animation on the Gonad shielding on the department's social media or other avenues in the radiology or medical community for broader reach?
Yeah. So where I last left off discussing distribution with my preceptor, he said he was interested in bringing it to radiology organizations like the American Association of Physicists in Medicine. So being able to embed it onto their website would be a great way to share it to people. But that's still one of our future directions that we're working on. All right, thank you. The next presenter is Grace Herzberg. She graduated from Iowa State University with a major in biological, pre-medical illustration, and minors in French and emerging global diseases. Thank you. I can take it from here. Okay, you got it? Of course. Oh, they're like cursor. Oh, it is. Please hold.
All right, hello everyone. It's so good to see you. My name is Grace Herzberg, and today I'll be presenting to you my thesis, Gamifying Radiology Education, a virtual desk for studying MRI pulse sequences. First, what we need to know is that the radiology residents need to learn MRI physics for their qualifying core exam to become a radiologist. MRI physics is a challenging and abstract concept to study, and it's also important to keep in mind that honestly, being a resident is stressful. Keeping all of this in mind, our objectives are to design an interactive virtual desk for radiology residents studying MRI pulse sequences, which will then be hosted online for free on teamrads.com. We'll measure knowledge transfer and engagement scores to see if gamification is effective for residents studying. And finally, we'll address resident stress using calming visual aesthetics. But wait, what are MRI pulse sequences? Well, MRI pulse sequences are a set of symbols plotted onto a diagram representing energy and changes in the magnetic field used to create an image when you get an MRI done of you. The orange in the image to the left highlights the energy being applied to your body. The purple highlights the gradients applied that manipulate the magnetic field in your body. And the pink shows the echo, which represents the readout that becomes the brain MRI image you can see on the right. Current study resources available digitally for residents are mostly static text and images presented with minimal and sterile visuals. These resources also tend to cost money, adding more financial burden to residents. So for example, a study resource provided by IMEOS costs $349 per year. Until now, there's been no interactive study resource that allows residents to build their own pulse sequences with immediate feedback. To create our interactive, first we created sketches of game prototypes. For example, the right image shows a preliminary sketch of what our puzzle game idea for building pulse sequences was. Then we created a clickable wireframes using Figma to simulate how the interactive would function. We designed pulse sequence symbols, diagrams, and graphics using Adobe Illustrator. And finally, we used the Unity game development software encoded in C# to create the interactive for use on the web. So let's go over how we made our puzzle activity together. The title shows the type of pulse sequence requested. In this case, we're making a spin echo pulse sequence. The puzzle tray contains all the pulse sequence elements that will be used. The puzzle grid is a pulse sequence diagram that puzzle pieces can be dragged onto. For a little more information, TE means time to echo and suggests where to put the echo symbol. TR means time to repetition and includes the length of the pulse sequence, which hints where the radio frequency pulses, like that 90-degree pulse, should be placed. We tested our prototype with 3 radiology residents by asking scripted questions and recording their feedback as they used the interactive. The image on the right shows our puzzle activity prior to user feedback. So we incorporated feedback gathered from our residents on our final version that you can see here. For example, the orange highlighted areas are elements that we changed after testing our prototype with our resident focus group. We moved the puzzle pieces and instructions to the top of the page for ease of use so that instructions are read before anything else. Oops. We distributed a survey to 12 radiology residents and 4 fellows at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Residents took a pretest, then were sorted into 2 media viewing groups, a group that viewed module materials and a group that viewed module materials with that puzzle we designed. Then participants took an engagement survey and a post-test. The media that we created includes the following: a virtual desk homepage with calming color scheme where users can access study activities, 45 module pages covering 3 topics discussing MRI physics foundations, defining pulse sequence symbols, and how to build a spin echo pulse sequence. We created a flashcard game prototype to practice rote memorization, and a practice test prototype to test for understanding. Finally, we produced a puzzle game for residents to build a spin echo pulse sequence and receive immediate feedback like we discussed prior. All right, so this video clip shows our puzzle activity. So the puzzle opens with a short review, and then residents may place pulse sequence elements onto that grid, as you can see here. So they're taking all the elements on the puzzle tray and dragging them where they think they might be. And when they're ready, they go ahead and hit that play button. So you can see a bar passing over, and it grades each pulse sequence element. So you can see one element isn't correct. So you can redrag it to what you think is the correct spot and regrade for immediate feedback. And when the puzzle is correct, you'll get a T1 brain MRI matching the spin echo sequence created. Results from our survey showed that both groups had a significant improvement in their average post-test scores. The module group improved by 2 points out of 8, and the module with puzzle group improved by 2.43 points out of 8 on average. Our engagement survey was comprised of Likert scale questions rating aspects of the interactive that they viewed, with a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the most positive. Both groups were equally engaged with provided materials, and all questions on average were rated at least 4 out of 5 points. We also asked residents to provide qualitative feedback. Residents listed words that came to mind while they were viewing the interactive. So both groups described the interactive as clean and organized. Participants who viewed only the module tended towards words like simple and straightforward, while participants who viewed the puzzle used words like fun, playful, and engaging. So in conclusion, our interactive yielded high engagement scores for both groups. Participants had significant improvement in post-test scores, and positive qualitative feedback was provided. Residents also requested more puzzles covering other types of pulse sequences. As for future directions, we plan to host our interactive on teamrads.com for free so anyone can study MRI physics. We also have a manuscript in progress for submission to the Journal of the American College of Radiology. Well, thank you for viewing my work. I would like to thank my preceptor, Dr. Aaron Gomez, my advisor, Jeff Day, the Artists Applied to Medicine faculty and staff, my classmates, the class of 2024, Johns Hopkins radiology residents and fellows who participated in our focus groups and survey, the Delta Grant, and the Vesalius Trust. I welcome any questions and look forward to discussing with you.
Dr. Aaron Gomez chatted online. She said, congratulations, Grace, on the creation of beautiful, interactive, and high-level educational resources. Challenging topic. Fantastic work.
Thank you, Dr. Gomez. It was so amazing working with you.
Can you talk to us a little bit about your process about
Of course. Yeah, so the question was asking how I was learning about pulse sequences myself and what that process looked like. So first of all, Dr. Gomez was gracious to give me an hour-long primer, PowerPoint presentation to me teaching about pulse sequences. And thankfully it was recorded so I could watch it many, many, many times over the next few months. I also was lucky to have a lot of online resources that I used. And actually through our focus testing with residents, they were able to bestow a lot of knowledge on me as well, especially sharing how their thought process works when engaging with pulse sequences. And I'm really pleased that I was able to learn more about physics in general. It's such an abstract topic, and I'm just really glad I was able to visualize it. Thank you for your question.
So it's really neat to create this sort of game. I wonder if you thought about any other applications for it, either in radiology or in one thing that does have to be radiation to treat cancers.
Yeah, so the question is if we can apply gamification to other areas such as radiology or when using radiology concepts to treat cancer. So I think that's a fantastic idea, first of all. Gamification, I think, is really engaging residents. And one thing that I appreciate about gamification is that it invites them to the table. A lot of study resources can be a little cold and not understanding of their situation or their stress levels as they come to their study desk. So I think gamification can kind of bridge that gap. I also think it's great to have that immediate feedback and be able to actively be building that pulse sequence, or if you apply it to different areas of radiology education. There's a lot of publications about gamification in medicine, and I think it's a really growing field. So I'm excited to see how it changes in the future. Thank you. right, thank you so much. Let's see. So I'm excited to introduce the next presenter, Chloe Wooden. She received her BS in Cognitive Systems at the University of British Columbia.
All right, good afternoon. Today, I'm excited to share my work on designing patient education visuals for pig to human kidney xenotransplantation. I worked with Dr. Elizabeth King in the Division of Transplantation Surgery, and Corey Sandone was my faculty advisor. Kidney transplant is the most effective treatment for end-stage kidney disease, but there's a severe shortage of available kidneys. In the United States, nearly 90,000 people are on the kidney transplant waitlist, and 17 people die each day waiting for an organ transplant, many of whom are waiting for a kidney. Xenotransplantation, or the transplant of organs or tissues between species, is a promising solution. Johns Hopkins is at the forefront of research into pig-to-human kidney xenotransplantation using genetically modified pigs. Clinical trials could begin as soon as 2025. As the reality of clinical xenotransplantation approaches, there's an urgent need to educate patients about xenotransplantation as a treatment option so that they can make a thoughtful and informed decision. Currently, there is a lack of visuals designed to support patient education in kidney xenotransplantation. Existing visuals are either designed for lay audiences and are too broad for patients, or they're designed for advanced scientific audiences and are too complex for patients. At Johns Hopkins, the plan for patient education is to run a series of 3 in-person physician-led workshops covering a variety of topics in xenotransplantation. This format is based off an existing workshop model at Hopkins that has shown positive outcomes for patients. The objectives of this thesis were to create the first patient education visuals on pig-to-human kidney xenotransplantation designed specifically for patient audiences, to design visuals that are at an appropriate health literacy level for patients, and to incorporate evidence-based practices for effective patient education design, such as using a simple illustration style, didactic color, and eliminating distracting detail. In the early stages of this project, my preceptor provided a preliminary script, and I developed an initial list of illustrations. Each of these illustrations was given one of 3 visual formats, depending on the complexity of the topic. These include standalone images, sequential image series, and animations. The process was highly collaborative, and I worked very closely with my preceptor to create synergy between the illustrations and the script, both of which evolved over time. I used several software packages to create the visuals, starting with Procreate, a digital drawing app for iPad to create digital sketches. And refined artwork was made using Adobe Photoshop, Adobe Illustrator, and the animations were created in Adobe After Effects. Transplant surgeons and patient educators provided feedback on the visuals throughout the design process, and their feedback was incorporated into the final iteration of visuals. In total, I created approximately 90 individual visual assets that were arranged into 14 standalone images, 4 sequential image series, and 3 60-second animations. Because these animations were designed for in-person delivery, they do not have narration, but they're intended to be narrated by the workshop presenter. The result of this thesis work is a collection of visuals created to support physician-led patient information workshops on kidney xenotransplantation designed for PowerPoint delivery. These visuals cover 4 main topic areas, including background on xenotransplantation, immune system and xenotransplant rejection, genetic modification, and where pig kidneys come from, and wrap up. And now I'll share an overview of the visuals that I created for the first 3 of these topics, starting with background on xenotransplantation. This section provides an overview of the kidney shortage, past and current research in xenotransplantation, and why pigs are used as donors. The next section is immune system and xenotransplant rejection. This covers how the human body reacts to pig tissue, how xenotransplant rejection happens, and why the immune system can't simply be turned off to prevent rejection. Xenotransplant rejection is a scientifically complex topic that requires the audience to understand multiple concepts that might be unfamiliar to them. Therefore, I designed one animation in this section to show how rejection occurs. And here's a short clip from that 60-second animation. So here we're looking at a transplanted pig kidney. We have antibodies that circulate in the blood that will enter the transplanted kidney. Zooming in, we see that the vessel is lined with pig cells that have markers on their surface, and human antibodies are going to attack those pig cells, ultimately causing kidney dysfunction and rejection. The next section is genetic modification. Genetic modification is key to preventing rejection from non-human organ donors, and without it, successful xenotransplantation would not be possible. Therefore, it's important to explain to the target audience what genetic modification is and its role in xenotransplantation. This topic is expected to be the most difficult for patients to understand. Therefore, I designed 2 animations for this section. These are stills from the first animation, Genetic Modifications in Agriculture. This 60-second animation introduces some of the concepts in the genetic modification section using an example that's likely to be familiar with the target audience. And the imagery used in this animation is intentionally repeated in the next animation, Genetic Modifications in Pigs. And here's a short clip from that animation. Here we're looking at a pig cell and zooming into the DNA level. We can see different genes are within the DNA. We're going to remove the pink gene. And zooming back out, we see that those pink markers disappear. And now the gene-edited pig cell is modified to look more like a human cell. This project successfully produced a prototype of visual materials to support patient education workshops in pig-to-human kidney xenotransplantation. These visuals are ready to present to patients during preliminary workshops, and next steps include presenting these visuals to waitlist candidates. We plan to collect feedback from waitlist candidates on this initial set of visuals, which will help to inform the design of visual material for additional topics not covered in the first workshop session. And in the future, visuals can be adapted for other modes of delivery, such as paired with longer form text for use on a website, online module, or printed brochure. That concludes the scope of my thesis work. I'd like to thank my preceptor, Dr. Betsy King, my faculty advisor, Corey Sandone, the surgeons and patient educators in the Division of Transplantation, faculty and staff of the Department of Arts Applied to Medicine, and the Vesalius Trust for funding this research. Thank you, and I now welcome any questions or comments.
Well, I just want to congratulate you on a really impressive body of work. I think you really did a wonderful job of becoming a content expert on xenotransplant, and really your illustrations informed a lot of the script and the things that we plan to say to patients who are trying to teach them about this option. And I think the most impressive thing to me has been and remains to be how approachable these visuals are for a really heterogeneous group of patients that are all coming with different levels of health literacy. So congratulations again.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to work with you. Thank you for all your help. I'm sorry, can you repeat one more time?
We talked a little bit about weight.
Yeah, so to repeat the question, what was my process for coming up with the visuals and how we presented the immune system section? And that's a section that we sort of went back and forth on a few times, and feedback from patient educators as well as transplant surgeons was really helpful in that regard. So our idea was to make it as simple as possible to understand while keeping as much detail as necessary to understand. So for the design of the cells, for example, it's important to show that pig cells are different from human cells, but not important necessarily to show, the specifics of the alpha-gal and why that's an issue. So really trying to pare it down to the main message, which is that the human body reacts to pig tissue, and that's a bad thing, was what we were aiming to focus on. And then we intentionally tried to repeat as many of the visual assets throughout the presentation as well, so that they become a little bit familiar to the audience as the presentation goes along. Thank you. The question was which part of the presentation was most difficult to illustrate and why? I would say the immune section was tricky for that reason, mostly because of how to sort of pare it down in a way that patients would understand, and really deciding what do they need to know and what do they not need to know in this presentation. And I would also say the genetic modification section, for similar reasons, it's a very complicated topic, and it's difficult to explain sort of concisely and in an approachable manner. So even though the visuals were simple to create technically, the development of how to show that was challenging.
Say when clinical trials would begin? I'm sorry, I asked if she knew when clinical trials would begin. You have to do clinical.
Yeah, my understanding is that that could happen within the next 1 to 2 years. Thank you, and I'd now like to welcome our next presenter, Nicholas Kilner-Pontone. Nicholas graduated from Pratt Institute with a BFA in illustration.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be speaking with you all today about protein condensates called contractility kits and how they can be harnessed to fight cancer. So I work with Dr. Robinson, who runs a cell biology and cell mechanics lab here in the School of Medicine. I created a molecular 3D animation to describe some of his lab's novel research for a graduate student audience. So here's a brief overview of the content that I'll be discussing in the video. What is the mechanobiome? They are parts of the cell that allow it to sense and respond to mechanical force. A component of the mechanobiome is the cytoskeleton, of which actin is a part. They provide structural support to the cell and respond to mechanical force. Here is the 3D model of actin filament forming. These actin filaments form a meshwork under the entire cell membrane. This is an electron microscope image of what that looks like when the membrane is removed. For context, the background of this slide is a 3D model I created of a view within the cell cortex. The electron microscope image from before is also of this. So protein condensates called contractility kits, named by the Robinson lab, allow the cell cortex to become more rigid in response to mechanical stress. The model organism for these experiments are amoebas. The electron microscope image from before is also an amoeba. When mechanical stress is exerted on a cell cortex, in this case in the form of micropipette aspiration, mechanoresponsive proteins respond to this force in different ways when bound to the actin filaments. This increases their bond duration and allows for more of these proteins, which are pre-assembled as contractility kits, to accumulate in the cortex through diffusion. This continues until the stress subsides and the proteins begin to dissociate. So my animation project goals were to describe how mutations that create mechanical defects lead to cancer, the component protein of contractility kits, how contractility kits allow cells to respond to mechanical force, and how contractility kits can be harnessed to prevent cancer metastasis. To create the animation, I initially started with pencil sketches. These are scans from my sketchbook. Then I developed those sketches into an animated storyboard using Procreate to do the initial drafting, and then they were strung together in After Effects. These are some selected slides. Parts or all of the six proteins were hand modeled and based on published electron microscope measurements and reviewed by Dr. Robinson. The rest were drawn from X-ray crystallography data, as well as several AlphaFold predictions, which was created by Google DeepMind. These are the final protein models. They are at relative scale to one another. I imported existing protein data if it was available using a plugin called EPMV into Cinema 4D, a 3D animating software. It was rendered using Redshift and strung together using After Effects. The final animation is 4 minutes and 7 seconds. It was reviewed several times by members of the lab for accuracy. It exists on Dr. Robinson's website, as well as YouTube and LinkedIn. It will support Dr. Robinson's lecture material, as well as efforts to secure research funds. And now I'd like to play the video. Normal cell division requires regulated flexibility. Mutations that alter this flexibility can cause cell division failure, which can lead to multinucleated cells, aneuploidy or an abnormal number of chromosomes, and cancer, as well as entosis, metastasis, and a greater ability to evade immune cell attacks. The protein mechanisms that drive these behaviors are being researched in the model organism Dictyostelium discoideum, an amoeba. When mechanical stress is exerted on a cell cortex, it is able to respond and become more rigid when cross-linking and motor proteins sense this force. The cortex is filled with polymerizing actin. Cortexylin 1, bound to these actin filaments, experiences force, helping it to accumulate further at the cortex, as well as anchor the cortex to the membrane. Filamin responds to shear deformation, which activates its catch bond, and cooperatively binds. And alpha-actinin responds similarly to stretching or dilation deformation. Hexameric monomers of non-muscle myosin II, or NM2, form dimers, which assemble into bipolar thick filaments, their functional unit in the cortex. Tension can freeze NM2 motor heads in their strongly bound or isometric state. Both strongly bound NM2s and catch bonds drive the accumulation of more of these proteins to share this force and make the cortex more rigid. For these proteins to act efficiently, they are pre-assembled in variously sized, nearby condensates called contractility kits, or CK. These condensates are stabilized by proteins such as discoidin-1. CKs exist within a spectrum of mechanoresponsive to non-mechanoresponsive states that are calibrated by scaffold proteins called IQ gaps, which competitively bind to cortexylin-1 to regulate CK activity. A single or a pair of IQ gap 1s can bind, one of each, or a lone IQ gap 2. IQ gap 2 confers mechanical sensitivity. IQ gap 1 inhibits this sensitivity. There is always a gradient of both. Whichever is present in greater number drives overall behavior. During mechanical stress, mechanoresponsive kits disassemble and associate with the cytoskeleton at the cortex when needed. When the stress subsides, the proteins begin to dissociate from the cortex and reassemble back to their contractility kit states. This research has led to the discovery that the compound 4-HAP causes the accumulation of NM2s from contractility kits into the cortex, thereby making cancer cells more rigid and preventing metastasis and their other characteristic behaviors from occurring. All right, so some of the accomplishments of this project was condensing 9 research papers into a single narrative story and visualizing many different kinds of proteins, and in some cases without exact data around their bond. Challenges were learning the render engine Redshift, as well as the revising of the project until all members of the lab were content. Future directions. Editing scenes based on future research, especially around the regulation of contractility kits, which is still undergoing. Expanding the animation to include more information about each protein specifically. And continuing to refine the materials, lighting, and editing. I'd like to thank Dr. Robinson, my preceptor. I'd like to thank my advisor, Timothy Phelps. I'd like to thank all members of the lab for taking the time to review it several times. I'd like to thank the Vesalius Trust. I'd like to thank the faculty and staff of the Department of Art as Applied to Medicine, as well as my lovely classmates. And that's everybody. So I welcome comments and questions.
Beautiful animations. I wonder, some of the proteins they animated moved more smoothly while others had sort of were hesitant or jumping with them. Did you have any sort of basis to anything that you based that on, or did you kind of just come up with it?
So I tried to give everything a random vibration. If they were smaller scale proteins, then they vibrated more frequently. If they were larger, then the vibration was reduced. In reality, all of these proteins are vibrating to a much greater degree than what is visualized, but that was kept down for simplicity's sake and also clarity. They also have more random collisions than what I displayed in the animation, but to keep it as condensed as possible and not show a bunch of unimportant collisions, I had at least one random collision and then a bond occurred. And usually during bonding, the vibration tag was reduced because yes, they are continuing to vibrate, but at a lower degree when they're bound to one.
So with all of that in mind, considering how many different complicated shaped proteins, like how did you decide visually to make them distinct from one another for simplicity's sake?
So the question was, how did I choose to simplify all of the proteins and keep them all visually distinct? So some of the proteins were at a lower confidence level as far as their folded structure than others. I tried to unify all of the proteins around the simplest proteins that were part of my grouping. And then they were all color-coded with a distinct enough hue and then color blindness tested to make sure that they were all a visually distinct color on screen for 2 different kinds of color blindness.
Yeah, but nobody is surprised that it makes sense. I think you just challenge the HHMI's interactive facility series and challenge them. And just for everybody's context here, actually, everything is actually pretty close with the exception of slightly improved. So kudos to you, but we're going to use this a lot. It's been a tremendous pleasure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elizabeth. Okay, and with that, I'd like to present our next presenter, Monal Chong. She's an interventional radiologist from the National Taiwan University Hospital. She specializes in pediatric radiology and congenital heart disease imaging.
Okay, hello, everybody. Good afternoon. For my thesis, I developed a game-based learning module for central venous catheter, which I will refer to as CVC in the following slides. I had the pleasure of working with Director Geoffrey Muller at the Simulation Center and my faculty advisor, Jennifer Fairman. So medical professionals often rely on simulation labs to sharpen their procedural skills. However, simulation education is very costly and produces a significant amount of waste. This is especially true for procedures like CVC placement, which involves a large number of instruments. The photograph shown here depicts the amount of trash produced in just one session of CVC placement training for 12 students. CVC is a large bore catheter inserted into the body via the internal jugular, subclavian, or femoral veins. The image on the left is a triple lumen CVC here. CVC placement is a very common sterile procedure in the hospital, performed in multiple steps, such as sterilization, anesthesia, vessel puncture, and vice versa using various instruments. This is the unboxing video of a standard CVC kit used here at Hopkins, which costs about $200 and contains a repertoire of over 10 distinct items. Opening the kit for the first time can be very overwhelming for students. While there's a lot of research out there on improving the learning curve for CVC placement itself, there's a lack of study on how to organize the kit efficiently so students don't fumble to find items during the procedure. Our study aimed to address these issues by creating a teaching game module that allows students to familiarize themselves with the kit repeatedly without having to open one. IRB approved our project to be examined. There are 3 main phases in our study. In phase 1, we observe how experts, defined as having more than 5 years of clinical experience, lay out their items on the table and perform the procedure on a mannequin while wearing an eye tracking device. We recruited seasoned medical professionals from the anesthesiology, pediatric, and nursing departments, a process that was not easy because each individual session took about 2 hours. They were provided a mannequin and a real CVC kit. We ask them to wear an eye tracking device while arranging the items in the kit to capture the focus of their gaze during the process. From our observation in phase 1, we learned that even though these experts do not necessarily arrange their items the same way, they all tend to group the items by function. For example, all suture-related items are gathered and grouped together in these 4 different layouts, marked in yellow. With that in mind, we started phase 2, game building, which includes both an online web game and 3D printed game pieces. This is the landing page of the online web game, an animated introduction of all the major items in the kit, with clickables for more information. And finally, an interactive practice module that allows students to drag around the items as in real life and group them by function into 5 categories: sterilization, local anesthesia, puncture, insertion, suture, and secure. A total of 18 assets were 3D modeled in Cinema 4D and rendered with Redshift. The assets were imported into Unity to be coded for interactivity, which is then embedded into a website built with WordPress and page layer. In addition to the web game, we also 3D printed all the models to be used in class as teaching aids, enhancing a learning experience with tactile elements. We first printed the models as mini replicas, which you will see later at the grad show, that were only a quarter of the original size. We can see its comparison to the real kit on screen. These are very tricky to print as some of the tiny parts break easily during printing. To address this issue, we printed another set of models as 3D cards. These cards are easier to print because of the platform that supports those tiny parts. We printed the monochrome to cut down cost. Mesh Mixer and 3D Builder were used to make all models printable through Shapeways. In phase 3, we invited 6 users to help test out the game and evaluate based on module teaching helpfulness, authenticity, cost effectiveness, and durability. The evaluation was conducted using Hopkins quadrics. The heat map here displays the average scores for each module we created: the web game, 3D printed replicas, and 3D cards, across 4 categories we just mentioned. They were rated on a scale of 0 to 5, with 5 being the highest. The web game received the highest scores in teaching helpfulness and the possibility of cost-effective repeated practice, but not authenticity, as it lacks the tactile experience. The 3D printed replicas were well received due to their high resemblance to the actual kit, but maybe too fragile. The monochrome 3D cards lack color details, but were deemed very durable. All users recommended incorporating the teaching module into the existing curriculum. The modules can be interchanged with other procedural skills besides CVC. This project serves as a proof of concept, offering a solution that allows learners to engage in repetitive practice without depending on expensive procedures kits. I would like to thank Director Geoffrey Miller, Professor Jennifer Fairman, Dr. Mike Roberson, and Jeff Day, the Simulation Center, and all the experts who participated in this project. I now open the floor to comments and questions.
That's really great. One of the things that stands out to me is, the game that you created. As I look at it, and you have the person that's playing it sort of putting things in bins. that person would have to be visualizing every step that they're doing in the procedure, which is actually a really great way to learn procedures, learn surgical techniques. And so, the way it mirrors that practice or sort of forces the player to go through that practice is probably providing additional. Really neat.
Thank you, Dr. King.
Other procedures in part where you use this sort of safety model?
Oh, actually, a lot of procedures I feel will benefit from this type of training module. I'm a radiologist, so a lot of interventional radiology kits are pretty complicated and overwhelming for first-time users. So I think those would really benefit from this sort of like teaching modules. And of course, like other stuff like a nostril gastric tube placements or like intubation instruments, all of those procedures, they would all benefit from this type of teaching material because it's like more engaging and easy to repeat without having to waste a lot of money or like resources in the simulation center.
First, good luck. Will be in. Something else just follow on our comment. And also discovered here is that this is a part of procedural skill training for this is complete checklist that you said the same, but it doesn't really tell you what. You can assemble it in a file and be very successful. Like this, you can experiment, figure out what's the best way. Suspect all of these things. Really, social option. So, I think it's very important.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. It was a pleasure working with you.
It's very impressive with solution. We want to explore what we want, considering the various tools and express this sort of sorry, the solution ours. This is something. However, the only way
You mean, how do I? Yeah, so right now the online module is designed as a hybrid sort of teaching module. There are prompts within the web game where we prompt the students to go back into the real world. And now please start practicing with the models we printed physically in 3D. So we were hoping to pull both like the benefits from physical 3D models and like the web games. And the web games are suitable for them to practice sort of on their own terms and at their own leisure when they have time repeatedly. And the models are used like in class teaching aids where they could play around with their instructors and learn stuff. Thank you for your early suggestions in the project.
While on the storage sheet asked, did you also record the speech kit opening sequence? It felt like a stop motion animation, not short and probably not made for on your pieces. You really enjoy watching.
Yes, I recorded I took about like 200 pictures when I was opening the kit, and I really just want to give people the idea of how complicated the kit is, like how many constants there are in the kit when they open ones, so people get the idea of how overwhelming it can be if you're a student who's opening it for the first time. Thank you, Jim. The next presenter is Sarah Zine. Sarah graduated from Lehigh University with double majors in behavioral neuroscience and fine art. She also received a Master of Science in Business Management and Entrepreneurship prior to attending Hopkins.
Thank you, Mona. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah, and today I'll be sharing my thesis called From Parthenidos to PANIB1, a multimedia exploration of cell death mechanisms and therapeutic strategies for Parkinson's disease. So, a quick introduction. Parkinson's disease, or PD, is the second most common neurodegenerative disease. It's currently incurable. Recent research shows that hyperinflammation may not just be a symptom, but rather a large cause or contributor to cell death and progression of the disease. And there are two main pathways of interest that we'll get into shortly: the C-gas-STING inflammasome pathway and the Parthenidos cell death pathway. I've had the pleasure of working with Drs. Ted and Belina Dawson at the Hopkins Institute of Cell Engineering, and their lab has uncovered a novel potential therapeutic treatment called PANIB1, which is a molecule that is able to stop the Parthenidos cell death pathway and thus slow or prevent the progression of PD. So I've mentioned Parthenidos a few times, but what exactly is it? In a nutshell, as a cell experiences large amounts of damage, oxidative stress, protein misfolding, more than it can keep up with, this damage becomes amplified by inflammatory pathways such as C-gas-STING. And in response, the Parthenidos cell death pathway unfolds in order to isolate and destroy these damaged, overwhelmed cells. So following this cascade, the critical protein of interest is MIF nuclease in orange, which triggers DNA cleavage and cell death. These DNA fragments then trigger more inflammation, and it becomes a vicious cycle. But that's where PANIB1 can intervene by stopping MIF nuclease. And so the premise of this thesis was to tackle three main objectives. First, to explain PD progression and how exactly inflammation connects to cell death. Second, to describe the Parthenidos pathway in detail, to illustrate the mechanisms through which DNA fragmentation occurs, which sets the stage to introduce PANIB1 and how exactly this novel treatment works. This was achieved through a twofold multimedia approach. First, a 3D animation that was educational, but engaging and immersive in order to cater to a broad audience. And second, an interactive web module for a peer-level research audience as a resource that goes further in depth into the science. To model the 3D animation, I used Cinema 4D and Maxon Redshift to render my scenes. The EPMV plugin was useful for importing accurate molecular structures that I obtained from the protein data bank. For post-production, I used Adobe After Effects, as well as Maxon Red Giant. And lastly, for building the web module, I used WordPress and Elementor. And just as a very brief glimpse into the development of this project, here is an example of the ideation process during the research, script writing, and storyboard stage, which developed further into more concrete concept art, which helped inform and guide my final 3D modeled scenes. And so my final animation was approximately 4 minutes, 15 seconds. And so today I'll just be showing you some very short segments, about 1:45. This works. A groundbreaking discovery in molecular biology sheds light on PANIB1, a potential therapeutic treatment for Parkinson's disease, which is a neurological disorder marked by the gradual loss of dopamine neurons in the brain. It involves the C-gas sting pathway, a vital mechanism that detects damaged or suspicious DNA in the cell's cytoplasm and orchestrates a rapid microglial immune response as a result. This process is linked to parthenidose, a cell death mechanism to isolate damaged or infected cells and prevent the spread of disease. But when excessively engaged, these pathways can lead to severe inflammation and unintended widespread damage if the C-gas sting pathway reacts to large amounts of DNA fragments created through parthenidose. Exciting new research has unveiled PANIB1, a groundbreaking MIF inhibitor that stops the last step of parthenidose. PANIB1 blocks MIF's nuclease activity without interfering with its other functions, and prevents the generation of harmful DNA fragments. MIF's unique structure differentiates it from other nucleases in the body, thus ensuring selective inhibition and minimizing adverse effects. Targeting MIF using PANIB1 shows promising clinical potential, and there is hope for a future where the progression of neuronal damage and symptoms of Parkinson's disease could be halted or even reversed. So moving on to the interactive web module. Next, I'll show you a scroll through of the web page. So starting with a timeline with animations that take us on a journey, starting all the way from alpha-synuclein misfolding and inflammation, all the way to DNA cleavage and cell death. Next is an interactive pathway that offers a deep dive into each of the molecules involved in the parthenidose mechanism. And following that is an introduction to PANIB1, with more interactive information about its atomic structure, mechanism of action, etc. And lastly, a repository of resources and links where users can find citations and learn more. And so to summarize the goals we achieved and future directions, through this multimedia project, we were able to transform complex molecular biology into an engaging storyline for a broad general audience in the form of a 4-minute, 15-second animation that will also be published on the lab website. And we were able to build an interactive, self-guided web experience for graduate level audiences to learn more about PD. Future developments include conducting formal assessments such as pre- and post surveys to gauge retention and effectiveness of the animation and module, as well as improve mobile device compatibility of the page and continue to update it as new research emerges. Thank you. That's all I have for you today. I'd like to take a moment again to thank my amazing preceptors, Drs. Ted and Belina Dawson, and members of the Dawson Lab, my amazing advisor, David Breeny, and the entire faculty of the Art as Applied to Medicine department, and my lovely classmates whose support I couldn't have done without. And I'd be happy to take any questions or comments at this time. Thank you.
see. We were really, that's really interesting. What would you say is the most challenging part?
Sure. Thank you so much. The question was, what was the most challenging part of this whole process? I would have to say the most challenging part was the pre-production process before I got into the modeling and the animation. A lot of this biology is not very linear. There are these pathways that have these interconnected relationships. It's a positive feedback loop. There's a lot of interplay between different molecular mechanisms. And so deciding the exact order and manner in which to describe the science in the animation and building a script that was still very effective and accurate, but simple enough for a broad audience to understand, that was a really fun challenge. Yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Sort of futuristic quality to them. I wonder if that was deliberate or is it just happened that way?
That's a good question. The question was, there's sort of a futuristic style and whether that was deliberate. I definitely wanted to feel immersive, and having a very specific style is a great way to draw audience attention and retention. So I wanted it to feel like almost like an outer space environment, which is also conducive to reducing external distractions. So even though we are in a cellular environment where you would normally see many other structures, kind of pushing those things to the side and focusing on very stylized main characters was my goal. Yeah. Yeah, the question was, how long did the animation process take? Building the actual animation, research, storyboarding aside, I would say I finished the whole thing in 2 months. Yeah. Modeling, rendering, post-production, that part took about a month and a half. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. One last question. Thank you, Nani. I'm glad that resources like these are helpful and effective. Thank you. Thank you, and I'd like to now introduce our final presenter, Tanya Burge. Tanya graduated from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, with a major in biochemistry and molecular biology.
One second. Sorry. Okay.
Okay, great. Alrighty. Hi, everybody. My name is Tanya Burge, and I worked with Dr. Marlise Gonzalez-Fernandez from the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation on a thesis titled Designing Multimedia and 3D Printed Models to Engage Patients Considering Osteointegration. My wonderful advisors for this project were Andrew Etheridge and Corey Sandone. So to start on with providing a bit of background about limb loss, approximately 1 in 150 Americans currently live with limb loss in the US. The number of individuals living with limb loss is expected to double by 2050. Though many of these individuals use a traditional socket prosthesis, which serves as a connection between the residual limb and their external prosthesis, some amputees are unable to tolerate a socket prosthesis due to complications like skin conditions, neuromas, or a short residual limb. For these individuals, osteointegration, or OI, has become an appropriate option. Osteointegration is the surgical insertion of a metal implant into the bone of a residual limb. Johns Hopkins holds monthly OI clinics for amputees who are either considering OI or who have begun the process. For my thesis, I created educational resources targeted towards the patients that attend these clinics. Much of the OI-related media that I came across during the research phase of this thesis project focused on individual patient stories or surgical videos and images that could be of a graphic or 3D nature. Some of this media also showed the final results of the osteointegration process, which usually involves a person that's fully osteointegrated and weight-bearing. During our research, there were a couple of current limitations that we wanted to address in terms of patient education resources. Firstly, clinical communication was mostly verbal. In addition, the OI clinic lacked patient-focused visual resources to depict the full OI care pathway. And as a result, patients would focus more on the surgery without understanding the full rehabilitative process required for successful OI outcomes. Thus, the objectives of this study were to create a 2D animation which would outline OI care pathway features, which include pre-op requirements, post-op care, and rehab protocols. To design and produce a series of 3D printed models to teach patients about surgical indications, post-surgical care, and rehab. To provide educational material that can be accessed both within and outside of a clinical setting. And then to evaluate the materials with patients through an IRB-approved study. After the research phase, there were 2 different workflows that were used during production. For the 2D animation, after the script edits were approved, storyboards were completed using Clip Studio Paint. Simple vector assets were created in Illustrator and then animated in After Effects. For the 3D printing workflow, anatomical components of the thigh model were extracted from DICOM data using D2P. Models were then cleaned up and aligned using ZBrush and Cinema 4D. CAD softwares such as Autodesk or Mesh Mixer were optimal for engineering-specific tolerances for the models, so creating recesses for magnets, for example. We also resized to 50% life size using Fusion 360. The prototypes were printed in-house with our Formlabs printer, and then the finalized prints with the materials that we wanted were sent to an external company known as Stratasys. Now for the results, the final 5-minute long animation covers pivotal care pathway features outlined as such. They include candidacy factors, the implant types, information about the evaluation, surgery, rehabilitation, and long-term care related to OI. So the following is a 1-minute long clip from the rehabilitation portion of the full animation.
Rehabilitation. About 6 weeks after your final surgery, your rehabilitative journey begins. You will start with hip and core strengthening exercises before moving to a short training prosthesis. You will slowly increase the weight put on the leg until you can support your own body weight on the short prosthesis. After physician approval, you will be fitted for a full prosthesis and continue walking training, initially with the help of crutches or raised bars. Each completed rehabilitation milestone strengthens the patient and helps the OI implant form a stronger connection with the bone. Over time, you can tolerate physical activity unsupported. The time it takes to walk unsupported on a full prosthesis varies from person to person, sometimes taking over a year.
Okay, so for the 3D printed models, the following clip will demonstrate the design concept for them. It will show the 2 surgical stages of an implant called OPRA on a leg that was amputated above the knee, so transfemorally. Depicted in this clip are the various model components for stage 1. We have the thigh, femur, fixture, and the healing component. And then for the stage 2 model, there is an abutment that is inserted for the second procedure. And that serves as the external connection to the rest of the prosthesis, a short training prosthesis and a full prosthesis. And so that was the design concept. For the final results of our models, the 3D printed models were printed at 50% life size. The first model depicts stage 1 of the surgery, which involves the insertion of a fixture and the healing component, as I mentioned, for the healing process. The second model depicts the leg after stage 2 with OPRA, with additional prosthesis components for attachment. I also have the models with me today as well. For the sake of time, I won't pass them around, but please come find me after so I can show off my models a bit. So, an IRB-approved study was conducted to evaluate the effectiveness of the materials created in this project. Thus far, we've had 5 respondents who are OI patients for surveys and interviews. Though the study included surveys with knowledge and Likert scale questions, due to the limited number of participants, I wanted to focus on the qualitative input that we received during the interviews. During these interviews, patients noted that the animation effectively summarized the OI process. In terms of the 3D printed model, they really appreciated handling a physical version, with one patient actually stating that this felt like a physical version of what you would see on Google. Patients noted feeling intrigued or informed by both the model and the animation, and their feelings about OI were not negatively impacted. In terms of improvements, patients mentioned that the animation could benefit from more OI-related statistics related to final outcomes or body weight ranges for different implant types. And then in terms of the model, some patients did note that the model was pretty heavy. So the 2D animation will be available for patients and the public to view on a new webpage for the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehab. And then the 3D models will be provided to the clinic upon request. Future considerations and improvements for this project might revolve around continuing the IRB study to gain a better understanding of these tools on patient knowledge, the inclusion of information and resources specific to other OI implant types, such as compress, expanding the surgery, rehab, and long-term care portions to include information that patients might have requested during their interviews, and then repurposing visual assets from the animation into print material, like brochures. So that's all for my presentation. I would like to acknowledge my wonderful thesis preceptor, Dr. Gonzalez-Fernandez, and my great advisors, Andrew and Corey, for all of their help and guidance throughout this project. Additional thanks goes out to the Vesalius Trust, the faculty, students, and staff, my wonderful classmates of the Department of Artists Applied to Medicine, and the clinicians from the OI Clinic. Thank you so much for your time, and questions and comments are welcome.
I have a comment, which is congratulations to Baltimore.
Yeah. Thank you.
Question about whether this procedure is for people who are missing their leg limb, or if it can also be used for other people who are missing another limb, like arm.
That's a great question. To repeat their question, she said she was asking if osteointegration not only applies to individuals who have lost a lower limb, but does it also apply to upper limb amputees? And the answer to that question is yeah. The clinic is actually working on developing all the practices and procedures for upper limb amputees, but it has been applied to transhumeral, so above the elbow amputees thus far. They've used OI for those patients. And then currently my thesis advisor, actually, Andrew, is working on OI for fingers, which is really cool. And OI actually originally started out as dental implants. So the field has come a really, really long way. And they're trying to apply it to, other areas so that patients can maximize their quality of life. It's great.
I have a question about feedback portion. Patients that you
Yeah, that's a great question. So he asked, in terms of the feedback portion or the interview portion, was any of the feedback that we received from patients who have fully gone through the process? So they completed the rehabilitation portion of osteointegration. And my answer to that question is actually yes. We actually ended up having a range of participants in different parts of the process. There were some that were still at the evaluation stage, but others had completely finished and had been osteointegrated for a little while now, completed rehabilitation. And those particular people actually had more, I think, feedback, almost like retroactive feedback in a sense. And they also, having completed the process, had a lot more advice on ways to improve, I noticed. They had a lot more feedback on, oh, maybe including insurance information, because this is something, anecdotally, this is something I wish I knew when I started this out. And I think all of that was really helpful to carry forward in future iterations of both the animation and the 3D printed models. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I was saying but I was wondering about they were usually very basic paper from this much, and when it comes to specifically lower body types, Paralympic athletes, there's certain swimming, whether it's running, is it you have the ability to switch out for more suited for this?
Oh, that's a really great question. So she asked in terms of the prosthesis types for individuals who might be more active, for example, like Paralympics. They have different prosthesis types to accommodate that level of activity and whether that could be switched out with an OI implant. And so my understanding, at least, is that every prosthesis is going to be custom made to a certain degree. When it comes to osteointegration, at least from my understanding, there is a limit to the level of activity that you would be able to do with that implant. You wouldn't be, you wouldn't have the best outcome with trying to do maybe like athlete, like a Olympian athlete level activities. And so of course that's going to place a limitation to the type of prosthesis device that you would be using. And of course, Dr. D, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my understanding of it. But every prosthesis with the OI implant and with the connector that it used can be kind of like tailor-made for each individual. The limits of that will depend on the activity level. Yeah. Oh, hey.
And in our online audience, along the storage, we asked practice in Clip Studio. May I ask if there is a specific reason you chose to use Clip Studio over Photoshop or another program?
Oh, thank you for your question, Sora. Hi. It was mainly a convenience. That it was easy to do my storyboards from home, and I have a Surface Pro at home, and I use Clip Studio on that. That's the software I'm most comfortable on. So yeah, mainly convenience. Yeah.
How many patients share complex that's in research very different. I'll see their sonography.
Mhm. That's a really great question. I appreciate that. That is something that we kind of tried to explore with this project. It's definitely the start of this for me at least, but also with using 3D printed models and targeted towards patient education. This work that I did for this was kind of the start to exploring like what can people really gain from using these models. And I think at least from my understanding, having a physical version, something that they can hold or something that they can visually see, turn around, manipulate, it helps patients or feel a little bit more connected to the procedure, to what might be happening to them. At least in a discussion, and this is anecdotally, of course, in a discussion with one particular patient, it was just, it helped them kind of connect the dots a little bit better. And in particular for OI, I think some of the feedback I've heard is that there's a bit of crossing your fingers. You've seen the pictures online, right? You see the videos, but there's a bit of crossing your fingers when you go through the procedure and when you open your eyes from the surgery, wondering what it's going to look like. And the hope is that having a physical model can help them get closer to that vision a little bit more. It may not be the exact thing, but hopefully having something physical that they can see and manipulate will get them a little bit closer to understanding that beforehand. So yeah, that's the question.
Wonderful job. And then before, the question that I have is, what would be the most difficult part of the interview?
Ooh, that's a good question. So I would say the most difficult part for this entire project for me was managing dual workflows, managing the 2D animation workflow, but then also creating the 3D printed models. The 3D printed models in particular was like a new challenge for me. And so my thesis advisor, Andrew, was pivotal to that and to kind of reframing all of the things that I've been doing either in 3D modeling software like ZBrush and things like that and putting it in the physical form. That part was the most difficult for me. And I think my advisor really alleviated that pressure point a lot. So yeah. All right, that's it from me. Back to Corey.
What a great afternoon of information. Again, tremendous projects from this year's class. I want to thank all the preceptors who are here. Would everyone who precepted one of the theses this year, just please stand up so that we can recognize you. Thank you very much. And the other preceptors as well. I want to thank everybody in the remote audience. And sadly for you, you won't be able to join us for the reception, but the rest of us, we will walk over to the reception in the Phipps building, and everyone will have an opportunity to congratulate the students and look at the other artwork that they created throughout their 2-year program. So thank you again to everyone for coming, and congratulations to the students. You did an outstanding job.